Sarah's heart raced as she stepped into Willow Creek Nursing Home, unaware that her world was about to shatter. The familiar corridors, once a source of comfort, now held an unsettling secret. As she made her rounds, a gnawing suspicion grew in the pit of her stomach. Something was terribly wrong. The truth hit her like a sledgehammer. A trusted colleague, someone she had worked alongside for years, was abusing the very people they were meant to protect. Sarah's mind reeled as she grappled with the enormity of the situation. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, threatening to crush her resolve. But Sarah wasn't one to back down from a challenge. As she looked into the weary eyes of the residents she had sworn to care for, she knew she had to act. Little did she know, her decision that day would set in motion a chain of events that would ripple through nursing homes across the country, touching countless lives in ways she could never have imagined. The sun crept over the horizon, casting a warm glow on the brick facade of Willow Creek Nursing Home. Sarah, a seasoned nurse with kind eyes and a reassuring smile, arrived for her shift. She moved through the halls with practiced efficiency, greeting her colleagues and checking on her patients. In room 203, Mrs. Jenkins sat up in her bed, her silver hair neatly combed. Her wrinkled hands smoothed the blanket as she gazed out the window, a wistful expression on her face. Sarah knocked softly before entering, her voice warm as she greeted the elderly woman.
Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins. How are you feeling today?
Mrs. Jenkins turned, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Sarah.
Oh, just fine, dear. Another day to be grateful for.
As Sarah helped Mrs. Jenkins prepare for the day, she couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in the woman's hands. Mrs. Jenkins had always been a beacon of kindness in the nursing home, her gentle nature touching everyone around her. But lately, Sarah had sensed a growing unease in her demeanor. The day unfolded with its usual rhythm: medication rounds, physical therapy sessions, and social activities. Sarah found herself juggling multiple tasks, a common challenge in the understaffed facility. She rushed from room to room, addressing call lights and managing medication schedules. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, a constant reminder of the vital role she played in her patients' lives. Just before lunch, a new face appeared in the hallway. Rachel, the recently hired nurse, strode confidently towards the nurses' station. Her uniform was crisp, her smile dazzling as she greeted everyone in her path. Sarah couldn't help but notice the bounce in Rachel's step, her demeanor almost too cheerful for the sometimes somber environment of the nursing home.
Good morning, everyone.
Rachel's voice rang out, drawing curious glances from residents and staff alike.
I'm so excited to be here. Who's ready for a fantastic day?
Sarah watched as Rachel interacted with the residents, her enthusiasm seemingly infectious. Mrs. Jenkins, usually reserved, even managed a small chuckle at one of Rachel's jokes. Yet, something about the new nurse's behavior struck Sarah as off-kilter. It was as if Rachel's cheerfulness was a mask, hiding something beneath the surface. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself keeping a watchful eye on Rachel. She noticed small inconsistencies. A fleeting look of annoyance quickly replaced by a bright smile. A sharp tone softened just as quickly as it appeared. These moments were subtle, easily missed by those not paying close attention. During the afternoon medication round, Sarah overheard Rachel speaking to Mrs. Jenkins. The words were kind, but there was an underlying edge to her voice that made Sarah pause. She lingered outside the door, straining to hear more.
Now, Mrs. Jenkins, let's take these pills like a good girl, shall we?
Rachel's tone was saccharine sweet, but there was a hint of condescension that made Sarah's skin prickle.
As Rachel exited the room, her eyes met Sarah's. For a split second, Sarah saw something flash across Rachel's face, a mixture of defiance and secrecy that sent a chill down her spine. But before she could process it, Rachel's megawatt smile was back in place.
Everything okay?
Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice neutral.
Oh, absolutely.
Rachel chirped.
Mrs. Jenkins is such a dear. We're getting along famously.
As Rachel walked away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The day that had started so normally now felt tinged with an undercurrent of unease. She glanced back at Mrs. Jenkins' room, a sense of foreboding settling in her gut. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the hallways of Willow Creek. As Sarah prepared to end her shift, She couldn't help but feel that this day marked the beginning of something ominous. The peaceful facade of the nursing home seemed to waver, hinting at troubles that lay just beneath the surface. Sarah's instincts screamed danger, but she couldn't put her finger on why. Rachel seemed perfect on paper, impeccable credentials, glowing references. Yet something about the new nurse set Sarah's teeth on edge, especially when she approached Mrs. Jenkins. During her break, Sarah found herself in the staff lounge, absently stirring her coffee. The door swung open, and Rachel stormed in, her face twisted in frustration. Unaware of Sarah's presence, she muttered under her breath, her words laced with venom.
These old fools can't even take their damn pills without making a fuss. Why did I ever think this job would be easy?
Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She shifted in her seat, causing Rachel to whirl around, her face instantly morphing into a mask of cheerfulness.
Oh, Sarah, I didn't see you there. Isn't it just the most rewarding job in the world? I feel so blessed to be here.
As Rachel swept out of the room, Sarah's mind raced. The contrast between Rachel's public persona and her private outburst was jarring. She couldn't help but wonder how such a seemingly unstable individual had made it through the hiring process. Later that afternoon, Sarah overheard a conversation between Rachel and the head nurse, Linda.
I'd like to volunteer to be Mrs. Jenkins's primary caregiver.
Rachel said, her voice honey-sweet.
I feel like we've really connected, and I want to ensure she receives the best possible care.
Linda hesitated, her brow furrowed.
That's very kind of you, Rachel. But Sarah has been Mrs. Jenkins' primary caregiver for years. They have a strong bond.
Oh, I understand.
Rachel replied, her tone never wavering.
But sometimes a fresh perspective can be beneficial, don't you think?
Sarah's heart raced as she listened. The thought of Rachel taking over Mrs. Jenkins' care filled her with dread. As the day drew to a close, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was brewing at Willow Creek. Rachel's arrival had set something in motion, something dark and dangerous that threatened the very foundation of the home they had all worked so hard to create. As Sarah prepared to leave, she cast one last glance down the hallway. Rachel stood outside Mrs. Jenkins' room, her hand on the doorknob, a look of anticipation on her face. The sight sent a chill down Sarah's spine, a premonition of the troubles that lay ahead. In the days that followed, Willow Creek's once peaceful atmosphere began to unravel. Subtle changes rippled through the facility, sending shivers down Sarah's spine. Mrs. Jenkins, once a pillar of strength and independence, now seemed to shrink before Sarah's eyes. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Mrs. Jenkins' appearance began to slip, her once neat hair hanging limp around her face. Her clothes bore small stains, as if meals had become rushed affairs. But it was the fear that had taken root in Mrs. Jenkins' eyes that truly alarmed Sarah. One morning, Sarah found Mrs. Jenkins struggling with her cardigan buttons, hands trembling violently.
Oh, Sarah,
She whispered, voice quavering.
I feel so clumsy and frightened all the time.
As Sarah helped, she noticed a faint bruise peeking out from beneath the collar. Mrs. Jenkins offered no explanation, her silence speaking volumes. The incidents began to pile up, each one adding to Sarah's growing unease. She observed Rachel speaking sharply to Mrs. Jenkins during meals, her words dripping with barely concealed contempt.
Come on, Mrs. Jenkins, eat up. We don't have all day for you to dawdle.
The harsh tone would vanish the moment another staff member approached, replaced by Rachel's trademark saccharine sweetness. Other residents began to avoid Rachel, their eyes darting nervously whenever she entered a room. Hushed warnings circulated among them, cautioning about the new nurse's mean streak. Mrs. Jenkins became increasingly isolated, her usual spot in the common room remaining empty during social hours. Sarah's instincts screamed that something far more sinister was at play. She noticed Rachel's subtle manipulations, a carefully timed medication dose that left Mrs. Jenkins too drowsy for visitors, a misplaced hearing aid that made communication difficult. Each incident seemed innocent enough on its own, but together, they painted a disturbing picture. Nancy, the nurse's aide, confided in Sarah one afternoon.
Have you seen Mrs. Jenkins lately? She's not herself at all. Yesterday I found her crying in the bathroom, but she wouldn't tell me what was wrong. It's like she's terrified of something. Or someone.
Sarah's suspicions reached a boiling point one evening as she finished her rounds. Approaching Mrs. Jenkins' room, she heard Rachel's voice, low and menacing.
Listen here, you old bat. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, I'll make sure you regret it. Who do you think they'll believe? A senile old woman or a respected nurse?
Sarah froze, hand on the doorknob, heart pounding in her chest. Through the crack in the door, she watched Rachel loom over Mrs. Jenkins' bed, face twisted in a sneer. Mrs. Jenkins cowered beneath the sheets, eyes wide with terror. As Rachel turned to leave, Sarah quickly ducked around the corner, mind racing. The mask had finally slipped, revealing the monster beneath Rachel's cheerful facade. Sarah knew she couldn't ignore this any longer. The signs of abuse were clear, and Mrs. Jenkins needed help. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled out her phone and began to document everything she had witnessed. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to protect Mrs. Jenkins and expose Rachel's true nature. As she walked down the dimly lit hallway, Sarah's stomach churned with a mixture of determination and fear. The battle to save Mrs. Jenkins and the other residents of Willow Creek had only just begun, and Sarah knew the stakes couldn't be higher. Sarah's determined footsteps echoed through the hallway, each click against the linoleum floor a testament to her resolve. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she grappled with the nagging question. How deep did this rabbit hole of abuse truly go, and what would it take to bring the truth to light? As days passed, Sarah's watchful gaze caught every slip in Rachel's demeanor. The incidents of verbal abuse became more frequent, as if a dam had broken within her. In the dining room, Sarah overheard Rachel snapping at Mrs. Jenkins, her voice dripping with disdain.
For heaven's sake, stop spilling your food like a child. It's disgusting.
The words were quickly followed by a saccharine.
Oh, don't worry, dear. Accidents happen to everyone.
As another staff member approached,
Mrs. Jenkins' once vibrant spirit dimmed with each passing day. Her shoulders hunched, her gaze downcast, as if trying to make herself invisible. She flinched at sudden movements and loud noises, her body tensed for an attack that might come at any moment. Sarah's heart ached as she watched the strong, independent woman she had known for years shrink into a shell of her former self. The psychological impact of the abuse was evident in every trembling gesture and fearful glance. Mrs. Jenkins began to withdraw from social activities, preferring the isolation of her room to the company of others. When Sarah managed to coax her out, Mrs. Jenkins' eyes darted nervously around the common area, as if searching for threats in every corner. The tension in Willow Creek reached a breaking point one afternoon. Sarah was helping Mr. Thompson with his physical therapy when she heard a commotion in the hallway. She excused herself and hurried towards the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The scene that greeted her would be forever etched in her memory. Rachel stood behind Mrs. Jenkins' wheelchair, her face contorted with rage. With a forceful shove, she propelled the chair forward, causing Mrs. Jenkins to cry out in fear and pain.
Move, you useless old bag.
Rachel hissed, seemingly unaware of Sarah's presence.
You're always in the way.
Time seemed to stand still as Sarah processed what she had just witnessed. In that moment, all of Sarah's doubts evaporated, replaced by a steely determination to protect Mrs. Jenkins and expose Rachel's true nature. As Rachel looked up and saw Sarah, her eyes widened in shock. For a brief instant, pure malice flashed across her face before she schooled her features into a look of concern.
Oh, Mrs. Jenkins, are you all right? The chair must have caught on something. Let me help you.
Sarah stood rooted to the spot, torn between the urge to confront Rachel immediately and the need to gather more evidence. She knew that one witness account might not be enough to bring Rachel down. As she watched Rachel fuss over Mrs. Jenkins with false concern, Sarah's mind raced with plans and fears. The battle lines had been drawn, and Sarah knew that the coming days would test her courage and conviction like never before. Sarah's heart sank as she observed the haunting transformation in Mrs. Jenkins. The once vibrant woman now slouched in her chair, her eyes devoid of their usual warmth. Dark circles rimmed her sunken gaze, and her skin had taken on a sickly pallor. More than the physical changes, it was the emotional shift that truly alarmed Sarah. Mrs. Jenkins, once gregarious and kind, now shrank from human contact, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if afraid to meet anyone's eyes. The change in Mrs. Jenkins rippled through the nursing home, Other residents gave her a wide berth, hushed whispers dying away as she entered a room. The atmosphere grew thick with tension, smothering the once lively community. Sarah's research into elder abuse painted a grim picture of why victims like Mrs. Jenkins often remained silent. Fear, shame, and the belief that no one would listen conspired to keep them trapped in their private nightmares. As days passed, Sarah's suspicions crystallized. She noticed how Mrs. Jenkins' distress peaked during Rachel's shifts, how other residents' behavior changed in Rachel's presence. Each observation added another piece to the troubling puzzle. The tension reached a crescendo one afternoon as Sarah approached Mrs. Jenkins' room for a routine check. She paused outside the door, hearing Rachel's falsely sweet voice within.
Now, Mrs. Jenkins, you know better than to cause trouble. We wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen, would we?
Sarah's blood ran cold at the thinly veiled threat. She steeled herself before entering the room, only to find her worst fears confirmed. Mrs. Jenkins sat rigid in her chair, eyes wide with terror. As Rachel acknowledged Sarah's presence, Mrs. Jenkins flinched visibly, her whole body recoiling as if expecting a blow. In that moment, Sarah knew she could no longer stand idle. The silent cry for help in Mrs. Jenkins' eyes drowned out all other concerns. Yet Sarah realized that her word alone might not be enough to bring Rachel to justice. She needed irrefutable proof, concrete evidence that would expose Rachel's true nature and protect the vulnerable residents of Willow Creek. As Sarah left the room, her mind raced with possibilities. How could she gather the evidence needed to stop Rachel once and for all? The weight of responsibility pressed down upon her, but Sarah's resolve only grew stronger. She would be the voice for those who could not speak, the protector of those who could not defend themselves. The battle to save Mrs. Jenkins and her fellow residents had begun, and Sarah was determined to see it through to the end. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the dimly lit hallway as she made her final rounds. The night had been uneventful, but a sense of unease clung to her like a second skin. As she approached Mrs. Jenkins' room, a muffled cry caught her attention. She paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, heart pounding in her chest. The scene that unfolded before her eyes would be forever seared into her memory. Rachel stood over Mrs. Jenkins' bed, her face contorted with rage. With one hand, she gripped Mrs. Jenkins' frail arm, twisting it at an unnatural angle. The other hand held a pillow, pressed firmly against the elderly woman's face.
You worthless old hag,
Rachel hissed, her voice dripping with venom.
no one would miss you if you just stopped breathing.
Sarah's world tilted on its axis. Time seemed to slow as she processed the horror before her. In that moment, all her doubts and hesitations evaporated, replaced by a surge of protective fury. She burst into the room, her voice ringing out with a strength she didn't know she possessed.
Rachel, stop this immediately.
Rachel jerked back, releasing Mrs. Jenkins and whirling to face Sarah. For a split second, her mask slipped completely, revealing the monster beneath. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the rage was replaced by a look of wide-eyed innocence.
Oh, Sarah, I'm so glad you're here. Mrs. Jenkins was having trouble breathing. I was just trying to help her sit up.
The lie hung in the air between them, as transparent as glass. Sarah moved swiftly to Mrs. Jenkins' side, her trained eyes taking in the bruises forming on the woman's arm, the terror etched across her face. Mrs. Jenkins clung to Sarah, her body racked with silent sobs. As the adrenaline of the moment faded, Sarah found herself grappling with an impossible decision. The evidence of abuse was undeniable, but would her word be enough? She knew the challenges whistleblowers faced in healthcare settings, the potential for retaliation, the risk of being labeled a troublemaker, the fear of jeopardizing one's career. Sarah's mind raced as she considered her options. She couldn't let this continue, but she needed more than just her own testimony. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon her, threatening to crush her beneath its burden. As she comforted Mrs. Jenkins, murmuring soothing words and gently stroking her hair, a plan began to form in Sarah's mind. The security cameras. They were the silent witnesses to everything that happened within Willow Creek's walls. If she could access the footage, she would have irrefutable proof of Rachel's abuse. With a gentle squeeze of Mrs. Jenkins's hand, Sarah stood. Her voice was steady as she addressed Rachel, who still hovered nearby, her face a mask of false concern.
Rachel, I think it's best if you take your break now. I'll stay with Mrs. Jenkins.
Rachel's eyes narrowed for a moment before she nodded, her sickeningly sweet smile back in place.
Of course, Sarah. Whatever you think is best.
As Rachel left the room, Sarah turned her attention back to Mrs. Jenkins. The elderly woman's eyes were filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. Sarah leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper.
Don't worry, Mrs. Jenkins. I'm going to make this right. You're safe now.
With a deep breath, Sarah steeled herself for what lay ahead. She would review the security footage, gather the evidence needed to expose Rachel's true nature, and bring an end to the abuse that had plagued Willow Creek. The battle to protect the vulnerable residents had reached its turning point, and Sarah was ready to fight with everything she had. Sarah's fingers trembled as she accessed the security footage, her heart racing with a mix of determination and dread. As the videos played before her, the full extent of the abuse unfolded, far more pervasive and cruel than she could have ever imagined. Hours passed as Sarah pored over weeks of footage, her stomach churning with each new revelation. The security cameras, once installed to protect the residents, had instead become silent witnesses to their torment. Sarah watched as Rachel's true nature was laid bare on the flickering screen before her. In one video, Rachel roughly yanked Mrs. Jenkins from her wheelchair, her face twisted in a sneer. Another showed her deliberately withholding medication, taunting Mrs. Jenkins with the pills just out of reach. The psychological abuse was equally horrifying. Rachel whispering threats, isolating Mrs. Jenkins from other residents, and manipulating situations to make the elderly woman doubt her own perceptions. Sarah uncovered a pattern of abuse that extended to other vulnerable residents. Mr. Thompson, with his failing eyesight, fell victim to Rachel's cruelty as she moved his belongings and mocked his confusion. Mrs. Patel, struggling with dementia, was frequently left in soiled clothing as punishment for her forgetfulness. As Sarah compiled the evidence, she noticed how the abuse had escalated over time. The most recent footage showed Rachel striking Mrs. Jenkins across the face, the sound of the slap echoing through the empty hallway. Sarah's research into elder abuse patterns flashed through her mind, recalling how abusers often start with small transgressions before escalating to outright violence. The weight of what she had uncovered pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. With shaking hands, she began to copy the most damning footage onto a separate drive. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder of the urgency of her task. As the last file finished transferring, Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She knew that taking this evidence to management would change everything. There would be investigations, questions, perhaps even legal ramifications. The peaceful facade of Willow Creek would be shattered, and Sarah would be at the center of the storm. But as she thought of the suffering residents, Sarah's resolve strengthened. She had become a nurse to protect and care for those who couldn't care for themselves. Now, it was time to live up to that promise. With the evidence clutched tightly to her chest, Sarah stood. Her reflection in the computer screen showed a woman transformed. Gone was the uncertainty, replaced by fierce determination. She would take this footage to management immediately, come what may. As Sarah walked towards the administrator's office, her footsteps echoing through the quiet hallway, she knew that nothing would ever be the same at Willow Creek. The confrontation that lay ahead would be difficult, perhaps even dangerous. But Sarah was ready. For Mrs. Jenkins, for all the residents who had suffered in silence, she would be the voice they so desperately needed. The time for action had come, and Sarah was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead to ensure justice was served. Sarah's hand hovered over the administrator's door, her breath caught in her throat. The weight of the evidence in her hands felt like a boulder as she knocked. Mr. Jameson's muffled voice called for her to enter. As she stepped inside, Mr. Jameson looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing at Sarah's grave expression.
Sarah, is everything all right?
He asked, concern etching lines across his forehead. Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke.
Mr. Jameson, I have something important to show you. It's about Rachel.
She explained her discoveries, watching as Mr. Jameson's face cycled through disbelief, shock, and finally, grim determination. When she produced the flash drive, his hand shook slightly as he took it.
These are serious allegations, Sarah,
He said, his voice tight.
Are you absolutely certain about this?
Sarah's heart raced, but her resolve remained unshaken.
I wish I wasn't, sir, but the evidence is undeniable. Please, just watch the footage.
As the video played on Mr. Jameson's computer, Sarah felt a mix of relief and dread wash over her. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the muffled sounds of abuse from the speakers. Sarah's mind raced, recalling the proper protocols for reporting elder abuse that she had studied so diligently. Mr. Jameson paused the video, his face drained of color.
My God, he whispered. How long has this been going on?
Sarah swallowed hard.
I'm not sure, sir, but the footage goes back weeks, maybe months.
Mr. Jameson stood abruptly, reaching for his phone.
We need to call an emergency meeting. Now.
His fingers flew over the keypad as he dialed numbers in rapid succession. Within minutes, the quiet office transformed into a hub of frantic activity. Department heads and senior staff members filed in, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. Sarah recounted her discoveries, each retelling like a knife twisting in her gut. Decisions were made with lightning speed. Rachel would be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. The police would be notified, and all residents would undergo thorough medical examinations. Sarah's head spun with the rapidity of the changes unfolding around her. Mr. Jameson pulled Sarah aside, his eyes filled with gratitude and regret.
Sarah, I can't thank you enough for bringing this to our attention, but I need you to understand, things are going to be difficult for a while. Are you prepared for that?
Sarah nodded, her voice steady despite her racing heart.
I am, sir. Whatever it takes to protect our residents.
As she left the office, Sarah could feel the tremors of change rippling through Willow Creek. The once peaceful nursing home was now in turmoil, its foundations shaken by the revelation of the monster in their midst. But as she walked down the hallway, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out, and with it came the chance for healing, for justice, and for a better future for all the residents of Willow Creek. The aftermath of Rachel's suspension hit Willow Creek like a thunderbolt, unleashing a torrent of suppressed emotions and long-hidden truths. Staff members reacted with a mix of shock, disbelief, and guilt. Nancy, a veteran nurse's aide, wept openly, while John from maintenance stood in stunned silence, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a haunted expression. As the initial shock subsided, a new horror emerged as the video leaks to social media. It goes viral, sparking a public outcry. Other residents, emboldened by Mrs. Jenkins' courage, began sharing their own stories of abuse. Mr. Thompson recounted how Rachel had deliberately hidden his glasses, leaving him disoriented. Even Mrs. Patel, often lost in dementia's fog, had a moment of clarity as she described Rachel's cruel taunts and rough handling. The revelation sent shockwaves through the entire community. Family members flooded the facility, demanding answers and reassurances. The once peaceful halls echoed with raised voices and tearful reunions. Staff members grappled with a whirlwind of emotions: relief, vindication, guilt, and denial, all intermingled in a confusing brew. As days passed, the full psychological impact of the abuse became apparent. Even residents who hadn't been directly victimized showed signs of anxiety and hypervigilance. The trust that had been the foundation of Willow Creek's community lay in ruins, leaving everyone on edge. Amidst the turmoil, state regulators launched an official investigation. Their presence added another layer of tension as they conducted interviews, scrutinized records, and put every aspect of the nursing home's operations under a microscope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the verdict came down. Rachel was formally fired, her nursing license revoked pending a full hearing. The news brought relief, but it was tinged with the bitterness of knowing the damage had already been done. In the wake of Rachel's dismissal, Willow Creek faced the daunting task of rebuilding trust and healing wounds. Support groups formed, counseling services were offered, and new safeguards were put in place. But the road ahead would be long and challenging. As the initial storm began to subside, attention turned to those most affected by Rachel's cruelty. Mrs. Jenkins, the unwitting catalyst for this seismic shift, remained at the center of everyone's thoughts. How would she cope with the aftermath of her ordeal? The question lingered as Willow Creek took its first tentative steps towards recovery, the shadow of Rachel's abuse still looming large over the community. As Mrs. Jenkins' recovery progressed, the impact of her journey rippled through Willow Creek. Her resilience inspired both residents and staff, serving as a powerful reminder of the human spirit's capacity to overcome even the darkest of experiences. The frail woman who had endured so much now faced her greatest challenge yet: learning to trust again. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the geriatric psychologist in charge of Mrs. Jenkins' case, implemented a multifaceted approach to address both physical and emotional trauma.
Our goal is to create a safe environment where Mrs. Jenkins can begin to rebuild her sense of trust and self-worth,
She explained to the staff. A consistent routine became the foundation of Mrs. Jenkins' rehabilitation. Every aspect of her day was carefully structured to provide a sense of predictability and control. Physical therapy sessions helped strengthen her weakened muscles, while art therapy and other nonverbal techniques allowed her to express emotions she couldn't yet verbalize. The staff at Willow Creek rallied around Mrs. Jenkins, each person playing a unique role in her recovery. Nancy, the nurse's aide, offered quiet companionship during meals. John from maintenance ensured her room was always in perfect order, knowing that predictability brought Mrs. Jenkins comfort. Even Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Patel, fellow survivors of Rachel's abuse, found ways to support her, their shared experiences creating an unspoken bond. Sarah remained a constant presence, reading stories of resilience and hope to Mrs. Jenkins daily. Though Mrs. Jenkins rarely responded, Sarah could sense that her words were having an impact. Slowly, the wall between them began to crumble. The breakthrough came during a music therapy session. As the therapist played a familiar melody from Mrs. Jenkins' youth, something sparked in her eyes. For the first time in months, her lips curved upward in a small, hesitant smile. The room fell silent, everyone present aware that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in Mrs. Jenkins's journey. That smile marked a turning point. In the days that followed, Mrs. Jenkins began to speak more, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. She started sharing memories of her life before Willow Creek, painting a picture of a vibrant woman who had lived a full life. As hope blossomed within the nursing home's walls, a new question emerged. How would this incident shape the future of elder care, not just at Willow Creek, but across the nation? The staff and administration grappled with this question, determined to turn their painful experience into positive change for elderly care facilities everywhere. The once peaceful grounds of Willow Creek Nursing Home now buzzed with frantic energy. Family members arrived in droves, their faces etched with worry and anger. The parking lot overflowed with news vans, reporters jockeying for position as they waited for the next development in the unfolding scandal. Inside, the atmosphere was no less chaotic. Mr. Jameson, the administrator, found himself besieged on all sides. His phone rang incessantly, each call bringing a new challenge. State regulators demanded answers, threatening to revoke the facility's license. Lawyers representing the victims' families circled like sharks, their legal threats casting a long shadow over Willow Creek's future. The staff, already reeling from the revelations of abuse on X, Facebook, and Instagram, now faced a crisis of confidence. Every interaction with residents and their families was fraught with tension. Sarah, once seen as a hero for exposing Rachel's crimes, now found herself the target of suspicion. The weight of collective guilt pressed down on everyone, threatening to crush the very spirit of care that had once defined Willow Creek. As the days wore on, families began removing their loved ones from the facility. Each departure felt like a personal failure to the staff who had dedicated their lives to caring for these elderly individuals. The halls of Willow Creek, once filled with the gentle hum of life, grew eerily quiet. In the midst of this storm, Mr. Jameson made the difficult decision to hold a town hall meeting. In a packed community room, he stood before the crowd, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands.
We failed you,
He began, his words cutting through the tense silence.
but I stand before you today to make a commitment. Willow Creek will become a model of elder care, a place where the safety and dignity of our residents is paramount.
The room erupted in a cacophony of voices, some angry, some skeptical, a few cautiously hopeful. As Mr. Jameson fielded questions, it became clear that words alone would not be enough. Willow Creek needed to take concrete action to regain the trust it had lost. Over the next few weeks, a transformation began to take shape. New security measures were implemented, including advanced monitoring systems and strict background checks for all staff. Training programs were overhauled, with a focus on recognizing and reporting signs of abuse. An independent ethics board was established to provide oversight and ensure transparency. The administration committed to a person-centered approach, empowering residents and their families to have a greater say in their care plans. Regular town hall meetings were scheduled, creating an open forum for concerns to be addressed. As these changes were unveiled, a glimmer of hope began to emerge. Families who had been on the verge of removing their loved ones decided to give Willow Creek another chance. Staff members, energized by the new direction, threw themselves into their work with renewed passion. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time since the scandal broke, there was a sense that Willow Creek might not only survive, but emerge stronger. As the nursing home prepared to implement its sweeping reforms, the question on everyone's mind was, could these changes truly transform Willow Creek into a beacon of excellence in elder care? As the dust settled from the scandal, Willow Creek faced a daunting path forward. The challenge lay in transforming this battered institution into a model of elder care excellence. A series of sweeping changes would redefine what a nursing home could be. The administration implemented a comprehensive overhaul of policies and procedures. A zero-tolerance stance on abuse took center stage, with clear reporting protocols and protections for whistleblowers. Rigorous background checks and psychological evaluations became mandatory for all staff, alongside ongoing training focused on abuse prevention and fostering empathy. High-definition cameras appeared in common areas and hallways, a constant reminder of the facility's commitment to transparency. The physical layout underwent a metamorphosis, with open floor plans replacing cramped corridors to create a more communal atmosphere. Resident rooms were redesigned to prioritize privacy and dignity, giving each elder a true sense of personal space. Tension rippled through Willow Creek as these changes took shape. Some staff members bristled against the new regulations, while residents eyed the transformation with a mix of hope and wariness. Sarah, now head of resident care, found herself navigating a minefield of emotions as she worked to implement the new systems. As weeks turned to months, a new rhythm emerged. The initial discomfort gave way to a sense of pride and purpose. Residents, feeling safer and more valued, began to open up. The once silent halls now buzzed with conversation and laughter. The true test came with the first round of independent audits. Anticipation hung thick in the air as auditors scrutinized every aspect of Willow Creek's operations. When the results arrived, relief washed over the facility. Willow Creek had not only passed, but set a new benchmark for elder care across the state. News of the transformation spread, sparking a ripple effect throughout the industry. Other facilities reached out, eager to learn from Willow Creek's example. For Sarah and her colleagues, the successful audit was more than a professional victory. It validated their belief in the possibility of change, a testament to the power of compassion and determination. As they celebrated their achievement, thoughts turned to the future. How could they build on this success? What other innovations lay on the horizon? The story of Willow Creek's transformation was far from over, and its impact was only beginning to be felt across the nation. Sarah's triumph at Willow Creek marked the beginning of a journey that would push her to confront her deepest fears and transform elder care in America. In the aftermath, she grappled with a whirlwind of emotions. Relief at exposing Rachel's abuse mingled with lingering guilt and trauma. Nightmares plagued her sleep, filled with Mrs. Jenkins' terrified eyes and Rachel's sneering face. By day, she threw herself into work, but the emotional toll was undeniable. Colleagues noticed the change in Sarah's demeanor. The once cheerful nurse moved through the halls with a haunted look, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Concerned whispers followed, but few dared to breach the wall she had built around herself. As weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The passion that had once driven her career now felt muted, overshadowed by the horrors she had witnessed. She questioned whether she could continue in a field that had allowed such abuse to flourish. Yet the thought of leaving nursing filled her with dread. Who would stand up for the vulnerable if she walked away? During a difficult shift, Sarah's path forward began to crystallize. A new resident, bearing a striking resemblance to Mrs. Jenkins, was admitted to Willow Creek. As Sarah helped the elderly woman settle in, she found herself sharing her experience. The woman listened intently, her eyes widening with each revelation.
My dear,
The woman said, grasping Sarah's hand.
your story needs to be heard. There are so many others out there who need someone to speak for them.
Those words echoed in Sarah's mind, compelling her to act. She began researching elder abuse prevention efforts, shocked by the scope of the problem and the limited resources available. Her first steps into advocacy were tentative, starting with talks at local community centers and retirement homes. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each retelling. The response was overwhelming, with people approaching her to share their own experiences or seek advice. As word spread, Sarah found herself invited to speak at larger venues. Nursing conferences, elder care symposiums, and local government meetings sought her perspective. Her unique combination of frontline experience and passionate advocacy resonated with audiences, sparking conversations about systemic change in elder care. As Sarah's influence grew, so did the attention she received. Local news outlets began featuring her story, followed by national publications. A profile in a major magazine thrust Sarah into the spotlight, her face gracing newsstands across the country. The article detailed her journey from reluctant whistleblower to passionate advocate, inspiring readers and sparking a national conversation about elder rights. Sarah found herself fielding calls from policymakers seeking her input on elder care legislation. Invitations to speak at national conferences flooded her inbox. The small-town nurse who had once doubted her ability to make a difference now found herself at the forefront of a growing movement. With the support of allies she had made along the way, Sarah made the bold decision to start a non-profit organization dedicated to preventing elder abuse. Voices for the Vulnerable aimed to combine advocacy, education, and direct support for elder abuse survivors. As she worked to bring her vision to life, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. As news of Sarah's nonprofit spread, it sparked a ripple effect across the nation. Other healthcare professionals, inspired by her example, began to speak out about their own experiences. Families of elder abuse survivors reached out, seeking support and offering to join the cause. What had begun as one nurse's stand against injustice was blossoming into a nationwide movement for change. As twilight descended on Willow Creek, Sarah gazed out the window, her eyes tracing the silhouettes of residents in the garden below. The transformation of Mrs. Jenkins' story, from one of anguish to a catalyst for change, resonated deeply within her. It had ignited a movement, bringing hope to countless elders across the nation. Sarah's fingers pressed against the cool glass, her reflection a ghostly overlay on the darkening landscape. The weight of their accomplishments settled on her shoulders, a bittersweet reminder of how far they'd come and the long road ahead. Elder abuse still lurked in the shadows, a persistent threat in nursing homes and family dwellings alike. Their hard-won victories remained fragile, demanding constant vigilance. As the day fades and the sky fills with colors of dusk, we're reminded of the strength needed to confront the injustices that persist. Compassion and protection are our guiding lights, illuminating difficult truths and giving voice to those silenced by fear. To continue this journey, click left to watch our powerful video where racial bias in healthcare puts Simone Evans at risk, as her medical concerns are repeatedly dismissed. Or click right to witness Nurse Linda's courageous efforts as she uncovers a dark secret of domestic violence in her maternity ward. Every story shared brings us closer to understanding and action. Take the next step by watching now.